Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a truly fascinating idea presented in the source material you've shared. The source suggests that India possesses this, well, extraordinary capacity for talking, maybe even a superpower in talking.
That's a really striking way the source frames it, isn't it? It goes beyond just, communication. It describes it as this full-throttle discourse, what the source actually calls a yapping culture that apparently just runs through every level of Indian society.
Right. It's quite a term. And our mission in this deep dive is really to explore the depth and breadth of this phenomena as presented in the source, helping you understand what this trait looks like, why the source thinks it matters, and how it plays out across the culture. And just to be super clear, we are sticking only to what's in the source material provided here.
Definitely. And the source makes a pretty bold point right at the start. It suggests if global influence or power was somehow measured in, like, sheer word count or volume, India would be the greatest superpower the world has ever seen, according to the source.
Wow. Okay, that's quite an opening statement from the source. And it traces this tendency back, way back, doesn't it, to deep roots. The source really highlights India's ancient reverence for the spoken word. It points to things like the Vedas
Among the world's oldest scriptures.
being passed down orally for centuries.
Yeah, exactly. The source emphasizes that articulation, verbal commitment, was fundamentally important. It notes that satya, or truth, was considered a spoken commitment. It actually bound people together.
So this isn't just some modern habit. The source presents it as a deeply embedded heritage.
Sure.
And debating, too, right? The source says that's always been part of the culture. Storytelling as well. Sacred.
Absolutely. From those ancient epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata, which were, originally shared through narration all the way to dialogues in modern Bollywood films, the source argues that articulate expression has always been deeply prized, really central to the culture.
Okay, so the source sets that historical stage, showing this isn't new. But then it says, in modern India, this heritage has sort of evolved into something else. A constant, vibrant national conversation that plays out everywhere. And it reaches, well, intense levels sometimes.
Which leads the source straight into politics. It describes Indian politicians as among the most prolific speakers you'll find anywhere. Election season, in the source's view, basically becomes this giant stage for elaborate promises, impassioned rhetoric, and what it calls poetic analogies that, well, frequently stretch the boundaries of reality.
Right, and these aren't short, punchy sound bites we're talking about. The source characterizes these speeches as lengthy theatrical performances, often repeating the same old narratives. And parliamentary debates. How does the source describe those?
Well, it says they sometimes resemble domestic disputes, complete with raised voices, constant interruptions, dramatic walkouts.
No.
It's a pretty vivid language from the source. It suggests that while, legislative productivity might be hit or miss, the political theater is undeniably alive and well. The source even gives a specific example here. Narendra Modi, holding the record for the longest speech in Indian parliamentary history.
That was in 2024, wasn't it? Clocking in at over 2 hours.
Yeah, over 2 hours.
And the source mentions he covered topics like slamming the opposition Congress party, weaving in Bollywood stories, using lots of political jargon to paint his opponents negatively. Standard stuff, maybe, but for 2 hours.
Well, yeah. And this is where the source makes a really critical observation, I think. It notes that Modi has talked for hours, literally hours, on major issues: stopping abuse against women, attracting investment in manufacturing, reducing poverty, big topics.
Right, things people care about.
Exactly. But the source immediately contrasts this volume of talk with its own presented statistics. It claims abuse against women has actually increased since 2019, that companies tend to avoid India and even mockingly refer to his big scheme as "wait in India."
Oof, wait in India.
Yeah. And that poverty has only dropped a small amount in the last decade, still impacting, according to the source's numbers, 80% of the population.
Wow, okay, so the source is really putting the talk right next to its presented outcomes and highlighting what it sees as a significant disconnect. Its view seems to be that, while scrutiny is crucial in a democracy, political discourse can sometimes look more performative than productive, at least based on these specific contrasts it draws.
And moving beyond politics, the source points to the Indian news media as, like, a fundamental cornerstone of this talking culture. It describes it as often chaotic, occasionally insightful, but almost always loud, intense.
Oh, absolutely. The source's description of primetime television debates is particularly vivid. It basically calls them less about delivering news and more about generating spectacle.
Totally. Often devolving into shouting matches where, in the source's words, facts take a backseat to volume and outrage.
Yeah, I think many people recognize that kind of format.
And news anchors, according to the source, often become these celebrities known more for their on-screen personas, their ability to kind of control the chaos, than for actual reporting. The source paints the nightly news as this battleground where voices just collide rather than communicate, suggesting the noise frequently drowns out any potential for nuance.
Now, the source does present one potential exception to this frenzy, a journalist named Polly Sharma. It describes her as someone who consciously tried to distance herself from the noise, taking a calmer, more analytical perspective, focusing on geopolitics, global stuff, rather than domestic sensationalism.
But, and this is a big but, in the source material, it immediately pivots to a really strong counter-narrative about her. It basically claims she's merely a biased mouthpiece for Modi and the BJP.
Oh, okay.
Continuously lying, the source alleges, about his achievements and slandering other nations. The source explicitly states that her platform, First Post, tries for intelligent storytelling, but the source dismisses it as just fiction and storytelling, basically spewing whatever the BJP wants her to say.
So the source presents her as an exception, but then hits you with this immediate, very harsh critique, suggesting her calm tone is just like a vehicle for a specific political line.
Exactly. Though the source also notes that despite this critique at levels, Sharma's measured tone has found a loyal audience, people seeking something different from the usual spectacle.
Right. But the source adds a qualifier there too, doesn't it?
It does. It specifically adds that this audience flocks to her as she spews the BJP line.
Okay, so the source is highlighting this real tension, a perceived calmer voice that it claims is still serving a specific purpose, yet somehow attracting an audience looking for substance, according to the source's framing. It's complex.
It's very complex.
All right, let's shift gears then. The digital realm, social media. The source describes this as just an unfiltered, nonstop dialogue involving hundreds of millions of users.
Yeah, platforms like Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram, YouTube, they're characterized by the source as these huge arenas for debate, discussion, and often digital confrontation. The sheer speed and volume are just remarkable, according to the description.
Every single trending topic, it seems, whether it's super important politics or something totally trivial, sparks thousands of hot takes, memes, almost instantly. The source gives that memorable example, right? The investor summit.
Oh, the curry craze, yeah, where hundreds of attendees apparently stormed the free lunch. The source says social media just had an absolute field day with that.
Yeah, you can imagine. But the source offers kind of a dual perspective on this digital space, doesn't it?
It does. On one hand, yes, it gives rise to influencers, commentators, citizen journalists, people finding a voice. But according to the source, it has also significantly amplified misinformation, polarized communities, and turned many conversations into, well, ideological battlegrounds.
And the source explicitly links this to political support, right?
Yes, it explicitly states this is how Modi gains wide national support, through this amplification and polarization online.
So the source observes that while all this digital activity reflects a highly engaged citizenry, maybe the volume of talking can sometimes seem to outpace careful thinking.
Mm-hmm. And it makes a really striking comparison here. It says China got it right.
Right, in quotes, presumably.
Yes, right, in the source's terms. By creating its great firewall and developing its own massive tech ecosystem to rival American giants. Whereas India, according to the source, just has these online forums where they can talk and talk and talk endlessly.
That's a pretty pointed comparison from the source, yeah. Suggesting the digital space, in his view, amplifies the talk without necessarily leading to, equivalent strategic or economic outcomes.
That seems to be the implication.
But this culture of talking isn't just confined to politics or media platforms, is it? The source shows how deeply it permeates everyday life, too.
Oh, absolutely. Indian families, for example, are famously expressive. Dinner tables often turning into these passionate forums on everything from politics to personal stuff.
Right. And weddings. The source calls them week-long summits for intense social exchange and conversation.
Yeah, exactly. The source even details how, casual interactions like chatting with a taxi driver or a shopkeeper can often involve these deep, unsolicited philosophical takes. It gives the example, Vishnu is better, no, Shiva is better, just everyday debate.
Ah, okay. And storytelling, beyond the ancient epics in Bollywood, that remains a vibrant part of everyday culture, too. according to the source.
Definitely. This cultural predisposition to talk, to debate, to express oneself is, in the source's view, not just a habit, it's fundamental heritage.
So if we pull back and look at what the source is saying overall about this talking superpower, what are the main takeaways? The source does point out the virtues, right? It's not all negative.
Not at all. It notes it encourages social participation, keeps public discourse alive, helps ensure democracy doesn't become passive. The right to speak is absolutely central.
So dialogue keeps society dynamic, alert, even when opinions strongly clash.
Right. And the source gives examples of real-world impact that actually started with conversations and dialogue. Things like public protests, student activism, civil society movements.
Like the anti-corruption rallies or the farmers' protests.
Exactly. It even includes that very specific kind of wild detail about cow dung being shot everywhere by a tractor during one protest. Shows the intensity, I guess.
Okay, so the source shows the positive side, how talk fuels engagement and sometimes even action. But here is where the source introduces what seems to be its core challenge.
Yes.
The paradox.
Yes, this is key. It points to what it calls a growing recognition that this incredible culture of speaking needs to be matched by a culture of doing.
The talk versus action dilemma.
Pretty much. This is perhaps the source's main thesis. Really, India has no shortage of opinions or debates, clearly. But translating that massive volume of talk into tangible outcomes, whether that's better governance, improved infrastructure, innovation, economic growth, that's presented as the much, much greater challenge.
The source conveys the view that dialogue should ideally serve as a launchpad, right, for policy progress or public service.
Not become a substitute for them.
Yeah.
Its concluding point seems to be that ultimately follow-through matters significantly more than just having a vibrant discourse alone.
Got it. So connecting this back to the bigger picture for you, the listener, understanding this dynamic as presented by the source, it helps you make sense of the information and, the global conversations coming out of India.
Exactly. You see the cultural forces at play, the different arenas where this discourse happens, politics, media, online, everyday life. And you see the core tension the source identifies between this huge volume of talk and the perceived pace of actual action on the ground.
So to recap the source's perspective one last time, it characterizes India as this superpower in talking, where debate is practically a national sport, second only to cricket, it says. But the source concludes that progress is frequently discussed, occasionally promised, but in its view, rarely delivered at the same scale as the talk.
Yeah, for all the noise and conversation, according to the source, problems aren't necessarily solved by talk alone. The source's final sentiment is maybe a bit hopeful, though. Perhaps someday the endless talking will translate into actual significant doing.
Until then, at least according to this source, India will continue to lead the world in conversation volume, if not necessarily in concrete results.
Which leaves us with the question for you to think about. Building on this deep dive into a society where talk is presented as so central, so abundant, what does that tell us about the relationship between conversation, trying to find consensus, and actually achieving concrete action in any culture?
That's a good question. How do societies effectively convert all that energy, all those ideas generated by robust discourse, into tangible, real-world progress, something to mull over?